This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Chapter 5 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Stuff you're not supposed to know here. California Press and Landlord. The story of Harry Chandler's rise to fame and fortune is usually told in the Horatio Alger manner, with the heavily emphasized moral that America is still the land of golden opportunity, and if one combines brain work and leg work, it is still possible to become a millionaire, and in this case, a press lord. The success story, in brief, is that of a New Hampshire Yankee lad who had to quit Dartmouth on account of his health. He went west in the days the West still called. Eventually, he became a, quote, circulation hustler, unquote, for a Los Angeles newspaper, came to the notice of Colonel Harrison Gray Otis, who owned the Los Angeles Times, became general manager of the paper, married the boss's daughter, inherited the Times, the ranches, the Mexican acres, the millions, and the policies. Yeah, well, why don't you include the secret societies they were probably part of? In those days, circulation routes were bought and sold, and with his first money, Chandler acquired a Times route with 1,400 names and supervised the delivery of papers. With the approval of this newspaper, he later acquired the circulation route of the Herald and also of the Express. There came a quarrel between Otis and his partner, H. Boyce, who then started the Morning Tribune as a rival and began to cut down on the income of the Times. And then it was that Chandler made the plan by which he became famous. As he himself boasts, quote, "I went to General Otis and told him the situation. He said I couldn't do it. I told him I could, and not only that, but for the time's sake I should. My scheme was to starve out the Tribune. With 2 of the 3 mornings' papers' distribution systems under my control, it would be simple to play them together against the Tribune. If a Times subscriber quit, we could swing him to the Herald, whereas he might have gone to the Tribune if left alone. If a Herald subscriber quit, we could swing him to the Times." Of course, no one but General Otis would know of my connection. The Herald routes were to be handled through a dummy, unquote. The scheme, which is legal and shrewd and supposedly good business, succeeded in 2 years in crowding out the Tribune. Boyce never knew what ruined him. When he was forced to sell out, he got no more than 5 cents on the dollar. Colonel Otis had tried to buy the defunct rival, but someone under an assumed name had succeeded in getting in on the ground floor. Otis was discussing the matter with Chandler when Chandler admitted it was he who was now the owner of the Tribune. After that, it was natural that Otis made Chandler his manager and finally his successor. Harry Chandler continued Otis's policy of attacking labor, his antagonism to the Mexican Republic, his general obscurantism. Otis made a policy of perverting the news concerning labor. He published every item which could be twisted and colored to misrepresent the trades unions and all movements by working people throughout the world which aimed at a better life for themselves and their children. Otis, of course, had a reason for his mad hatred. His paper had been bombed in the midst of a labor war. But Chandler continued the policy of labor baiting, and also Otis's antagonism to the Mexican Republic, and in fact all of Otis's reactionary and obscurantist ideas. And yet, according to editor and publisher, quote, "The Chandlers, a visitor at the Times plant learns, are fine people with old-time ideas," unquote. Humanitarians from time immemorial have dreamed of the emancipation of men and women from the drudgery of daily work. The machine and power age of today has made that possible. With the ultimate development of machinery and the elimination of profits for a few owners, it will be possible to provide all the food, shelter, clothing, and even luxuries for the entire American population. With the reduction of the working week to 10 or less hours. Shouldn't that be fewer hours? Grammar mistake there. At the present moment, there are 13 million persons who have not the opportunity to work even 1 hour a day. Under the ideal system, everyone will work only a few hours, and all will have economic security and leisure for physical and mental improvement. Is this what George Seldes actually believed? That would be shocking. Oh boy. That's naive. Continuing. But so reactionary is the Los Angeles Times editorial mind that even a shortening of working hours is disapproved. Quote, "The inevitable result of too much spare time in the case of at least the majority of the workers," unquote, the Times editorializes, quote, "would be to steer them into the only diversions they know, pool, poker, drinking, and petty agitation over fancied grievance. It would be a tragedy to wreck the whole economic program for a few hours more leisure hours that nobody would know what to do with," unquote. Evidently, Los Angeles Times editors have never done a day's physical labor in their lives. Being the enemy of labor, Harry Chandler has been the enemy of the Newspaper Guild since it began as an AF of L affiliate, and more intensely since it joined the CIO. On September 22nd, 1935, the Los Angeles Times published from Portland, Oregon, a news story which is notable for its misstatements regarding the Guild. Most newspapers make at least a pretense of confining their unfair reporting, misstatements, and anti-labor bias to the editorial page. The Times states in its news columns that, quote, "Seattle radical organizers are at work here." The Newspaper Guild, one of whose purposes is to control news of radical activities by advising editors, has about 20 members in one office, unquote. The news item boasts that recent Portland strikes have been, quote, "promptly nipped in the bud," unquote, and hints that, quote, "should the provocation be sufficient," unquote, the governor was anxious to see, quote, "just how good the National Guard is," unquote. So violent did Chandler become in his tirades against Seattle labor, dominated by Dave Beck, that he painted a picture of the city going to rats and ruin. This was too much for Hearst's Post-Intelligencer, where the Guild strike was on. Publisher John Bettiger, defending Seattle, accused Chandler of being, quote, "grossly unfair and misleading," unquote, and, quote, "hitting below the belt," unquote. The criticism is significant in that it comes from a Hearst paper. At Christmas time, 1937, the clerks of the May department store, who had been trying to get more than 30 cents an hour and some improvement in working conditions, without, of course, the support of the press, thought it opportune to go on a strike. The Los Angeles papers, led by the Times, headlined this demand for better wages as, quote, "assassination of Santa Claus," unquote. Oh, man. This is yellow press right here. And, quote, "murder of the spirit of Christmas," unquote. Well, good. Somebody finally did it then, huh? The liberal news participated in this anti-union campaign. All these newspapers were carrying a full page of May department store advertising at the time. Naturally enough, a few newspapermen thought there was a financial connection between back page ads, editorial support, and front page hysterics. Old man Otis had 650,000 acres of land in North Mexico, which he got from Diaz, the dictator. At the time, Diaz was pocketing the money and literally and figuratively selling out his country. When Diaz was overthrown, Otis couldn't get his cattle out in time. He immediately began a campaign for the annexation of, you guessed it, northern Mexico. Failing in that, he favored the formation of an independent North Mexican Republic, a buffer state, in which his cattle lands would be safe from the Carranza reforms. And Chandler consistently has carried on a campaign against the Mexican Republic. Upton Sinclair has told the story of how Chandler was once indicted, charged with conspiracy to ship arms into Mexico, and how he was acquitted. Chandler remains one of the largest landowners in Mexico and California. According to the conservative weekly Time, on July 15th, 1935, Chandler has proved himself, quote, an inspired capitalist, unquote. In 1899, he, quote, launched a syndicate which bought up 862,000 acres in Lower California. He and his associates built Hollywood, founded a vast agricultural colony at Calexico, which produced $18 million worth of cotton in 1919. He owns a 281,000-acre ranch in Los Angeles and Kern counties, stocked with fine cattle, a 340,000-acre hunting preserve in Colorado, an interest in another 500,000-acre sporting preserve in New Mexico, is officer or director in 35 California corporations, including oil, shipping, banking. The whisper, "Chandler's in it," signifies a good thing to most California businessmen, unquote. Throughout the valleys where Chandler and his associates own and control California crops, there is terrorism and the nearest approach to fascism in the United States. Outside the Hague domain in New Jersey, there is child labor and even peonage. There is starvation in the midst of plenty. There is vigilantism, tarring and feathering, bloodshed and violence. There is also big money for the Chandler crowd. No one has ever heard Chandler say anything which could be interpreted, even vaguely, as humanitarian, altruistic, liberal, or progressively intelligent. But there must be something in him outside the shrewd Yankee trader who slyly put a rival out of business so he could buy the ruins at 5 cents on the dollar and become a big shot. If you ask Los Angeles Times employees about the boss, they answer that last Christmas he distributed a bonus of $197,000 among them. Somehow the question of money and human dignity get badly mixed up in Los Angeles. And this concludes Chapter 5 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. We're going to take a break and come back with Chapter 6. We're back. Here is Chapter 6 of the long out-of-print Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Chapter 6, Lord Howard and His Empire. The repudiation of the Hearst Press, now general, is the climax of decades of criticism and doubt. The attack with rotten eggs stones and curses against the Chicago Tribune and other reactionary Chicago papers on election night was a sudden outbreak of long repressed mass disillusionment and indignation. These facts indicate that the American people are following Europeans in realizing that the press is a powerful force affecting their lives, and that frequently it is an inimical force. Yeah, that's because if you read books from the late 1800s, they tell you, and tried to warn, that Rome was in the process of taking over the press here. And that got done, and lo and behold, by 1938, Seldes is writing that. The time has not yet come when the enlightened, liberal, and progressive American public will be ready to throw stones at the windows of the Scripps Howard newspapers, call Howard the names they called Colonel McCormick, and boycott his merchandise. But the time surely has come when all of us who are interested in a free press, and not the Publishers Association commercial idea of the free press, should no longer fool ourselves by counting among the liberal and progressive forces in America the entire Howard outfit. The 24 papers, the United Press, the NEA Feature Syndicate, the radio stations, forming what President Coolidge called, quote, a world power influential beyond the dreams of any of its founders, unquote. To all these enterprises, the time apparently has come for liberal-minded men to say hail and farewell. Individual newspapers, especially those in the more progressive Middle West and Far West, seem to follow the old Scripps ideal, but the management itself has gone conservative. When Edward Wallace Scripps founded the Penny Press, now the Cleveland Press, in 1879, he had to borrow the money. Today, the empire Howard controls is worth about $100 million, parentheses, of which $28 million is real estate, end parentheses, plus another $10 million for goodwill. About a third of this empire was built up by Scripps, who became a multimillionaire without ever losing his integrity. He realized from the first day that it was almost impossible to have a free press unless advertising was practically eliminated. There you go. There it is. The only way to have a free press is to eliminate advertising in them. Right on. He's calling it like it is. Way back in 1938 is George Seldes. He wrote Lincoln Steffens. He intended to prove it was possible, quote, that the people can have a free press, not only without having it subsidized or endowed, but a free press that will not only support but magnificently reward those who conduct its various units, unquote. Steffens found him sincere and not cynical. Steffens said that Scripps, quote, avoided other rich men so as to escape being one. He knew the danger his riches carried for himself, for his papers, and for his seeing, unquote. Throughout his lifetime, Scripps stuck to his ideals, which were public service, positive justice as between man and man, as men, the promotion of the equality of opportunity, the putting into the homes of workers who had little time to read of honest, fearless thought in clean and concise form, impartiality incorruptible by social, political, or financial influence, and the square deal all round, without fear or favor. United Press men for a generation said Scripps endowed the newspaper institution with a soul. They spoke of the Unipress soul without blushing. The soul of this empire died in 1926. Robert Payne Scripps, the frustrated, sensitive son of the founder, became the largest stockholder and apparently the inheritor of the liberal tradition. He said of the Scripps-Howard chain of newspapers, quote, "The dictionary definition that appeals to me as applying to the kind of newspapers that my associates and I are trying to produce runs this way: befitting or worthy of a man of free birth, free, not servile or mean, not narrow or contracted in view, broad-minded, free from bigotry, not bound by orthodox forms in political or religious philosophy. I would add economic to political and religious, so as to embrace all of the principal phases of life in this developing society of ours," unquote. In Bob Scripps, the liberal spirit, if not the soul of liberalism, flickered intermittently for a little while. None doubted Bob's sincerity, but all realized that the other partner, Roy Wilson Howard, who in 1912 had become head of the United Press and in 1922 made a partner in the Scripps empire, was now its dominating leader and would-be dictator. This is the same Roy Howard who told the Chamber of Commerce of Denver, on the occasion of a banquet given him to honor the establishment of a Scripps-Howard newspaper, that, quote, "We are coming to Denver neither with a tin can nor a lead pipe. We will live with and in this community, and not on or off it. We are nobody's big brother, wayward sister, or poor relation. We come here simply as news merchants. We are here to sell advertising, and sell it at a rate profitable to those who buy it. But first we must produce a newspaper with news appeal that will result in a circulation, and to make that advertising effective, we shall run no lottery," unquote. Here in the statements of intentions we have a pretty fair history of the rise and fall of the Scripps-Howard Press. The elder Scripps twice tried adless newspapers because he knew that no free press can ever exist which owes a first allegiance to business. He supported labor unions in general and raised money for picketers, and he was not afraid to dedicate his press to the working men. The younger Scripps lived in the shadow of his fatal illness, but he wanted a press befitting a nation of free men. And the present head of all the newspapers, news services, radio stations, and other means of manufacturing public opinion in America says, quote, "We are here to sell advertising," unquote. That all-revealing statement was made more than a decade ago. Then, as Silas Bent reported, Scripps-Howard men were, quote-unquote, fighting editors. And, quote, "These papers not only fight on their own account, but put their strength joyfully behind other fighters," unquote. Even today we hear of Ohio and other journals carrying on a crusade against corrupt politics or for a better economic world. But with the disappearance of the Scripps family from the directorate, as well as the Scripps quote-unquote soul, the fighting spirit is also disappearing. And many quote-unquote crusades recently engaged in become open to a search for a financial or political personal advantage as vital cause. No such doubts clouded the Scripps era. The Grim Reaper has played the role of Santa Claus for Roy Howard. He has delivered him a new journalistic empire unspoiled by traditional journalistic idealism. You know, this is wild speculation, but I wonder what Roy Howard was really about, who he was really working for, and I wonder if Scripps, the younger Scripps, wasn't poisoned or something like that. Wow. This is obscure history. But who knows, it could follow the same path of vicious intrigues that we see in conspiratorial politics. True historical politics, in other words. I don't know. Let's continue. Free at last from the Scripps bonds, from the utopian idea of a newspaper defying advertising and business, Roy Howard has begun to follow Hearst in red baiting and labor baiting. He has begun the suppression of his highly paid columnists, has altered their views, and he has gradually changed the policies of his papers from liberal to phony liberal, and eventually to a more honest anti-liberalism. He has done so at a critical time in our history, when everyone with a minimum of intelligence, not only writers, is taking sides, and when it is easier to see the right side, on which there is always butter, than the left, which is not only unbuttered, but perhaps not enough to sustain existence. People take sides, and in the process, a large number change viewpoints, so that it is fast becoming impossible to see the literary and journalistic woods because of the thousands of lost leaders hiding among the renegade trees. But in the case of Roy Howard, no Browning can sing of his leaving us just for a handful of silver, or for a riband to stick in his coat. Money and power, as shall be explained later, are the dominating motives in this man's existence. But it is not a matter of 30 pieces or, in fact, lost leadership. Roy Howard, the Scripps partner, as a leader of liberal thought and progressive politics in America, is and has been an accepted myth. Had he been that, it would be easy to say he sold out, he abandoned his followers, he betrayed the usual newspaper slogan of truth, honesty, public service, the welfare of the common people. But Roy Howard cannot be accused because he has never belonged to the Scripps movement, with which he has always been associated, and to which his only relationship was journalistic marriage. It is the public which made the mistake of confounding a marriage of convenience with a union of liberal minds. The Scripps-Howard quote-unquote outfit did have an ideal, a program which it respected, and a crusading spirit, but no one can accuse Roy Howard of giving more than a Bronx cheer sort of adherence to it during the Scripps lifetime. The Scripps soul and the Howard police reporter's soul coexisted for decades without influencing each other. From his youth, Howard devoted himself to making money and gaining power. Only so long as the old Scripps brand of liberalism paid did he stick to it. After all, every newspaper and every affiliated enterprise which Scripps dedicated to the common people had paid 6% per annum or more, and there was no reason to change the policy, not for a long time. The change, which is now obvious, did not come, as many, including Howard employees, believe, with his opposition to the Roosevelt administration reforms, the NRA, the ill-fated and hypocritical Publishers Code, the NLRB, the Wagner Act, and other social economic developments which directly affected the pocketbooks of publishers and drove them in a raging stampede against the New Deal. Actually, the change came 10 years earlier and was the result of the campaign of the elder La Follette for the presidency. The Scripps Howard editors were for Robert La Follette in 1924. Their selection was natural, in harmony with Scripps family liberalism, but Howard went along reluctantly. No one expected La Follette to win, but it was a good fight. The Scripps Howard Press had, to its credit, a fine showing in all its towns, and a real victory in Cleveland, where the press, the largest and most powerful of the journals, until the formation of the World Telegram, carried the city for the progressives. The shouts and editorials of triumph made Scripps Howard men feel good, all but Mr. Howard. He was not looking at the election returns. He was looking at the box office. Business, advertisers, parentheses, the supporters of the Republican and Democratic parties, end parentheses, had attacked the chain in its vulnerable spot, the till, and the Cleveland press had lost a tremendous number of advertisements and a lot of money. Howard learned in 1924 that it does not pay in dollars and cents to be liberal. He learned then what all publishers know now, that there is little money in the liberal center, no money whatever in the liberal left, boycott and blackmail for the radical left, and that the big money is on the right, in the conservative, Tory, and finally in the fascist right. It took Howard a longer time than most newspaper publishers to find this out, because up to then he had seen Scripps making millions under the banner of liberalism. Scripps Howard editors are supposed to have the right to vote on their choice for president, and in 1928 the majority declared themselves liberally on the side of Al Smith. But Howard was for Hoover, and it did not take much maneuvering to bring the editors into line with the boss. The chain supported Hoover. 4 years later, it would have been suicidal to renew the support, and Howard very wisely went over to Roosevelt, to whom he remained faithful until Rooseveltian legislation, alienating the affection of most big business, made an enemy of between 70 and 85% of the press in 1936, and at least 10% more in 1938. In the final 10%, the most powerful element was Howard's 24 newspapers. And now it must be noted that Roy Howard has also been playing a behind-the-scenes role in American politics. Up to the time of the war, and for some years after it, he had been content with being a newspaper man. He still considers himself a quote-unquote working reporter, and would not hesitate to cover a fire if he found himself exclusively present. But Howard is also one of many newspaper editors and publishers who suffers from the Northcliffe complex. Northcliffe himself suffered from Napoleonic delusions and went entirely insane. Let me digress for a moment to say that, while sane, he wrote enthusiastic recommendations for a journalistic union. And after he went crazy, he wrote violent attacks on the union, which the anti-newspaper guild forces, including editor and publisher, are quoting today, apparently not knowing the later quotations are the ravings of a man about to die. Northcliffe, The Napoleonic publisher wanted to rule Britain, and the greatest disappointment of his life was not being named Prime Minister in wartime. But the Northcliffe phase which American editors copy is the make-or-break power behind the scenes. The role Northcliffe always excelled in and boasted most about, and whose chief hero and victim was Lord Kitchener. Like Northcliffe, in the anonymous phase, Howard also is trying to make himself and his press so powerful that he can name presidents and plot the course of administrations with no one but his mirror to applaud him. He had tried, in 1932, to name as Democratic candidate for president his own company's attorney, Newton D. Baker, which would have allied him with the Wall Street movement to stop Roosevelt, and with Tammany, and a year later he was attacking Tammany in his support of LaGuardia. This was pure opportunism. However, it is more and more in the field of labor that Roy Howard pursues his Northcliffian, if not Hearstian, way. He is no longer content with publishing newspapers, and everyone knows that one of the greatest powers in the world lies in the hands of those men who have the right to pick and choose even truthful news. But he must play a part in pulling strings and shaping events, invisible like all gods. National politics was fun, fed the ego, and held out hope of profit. But ever since the labor movement began to open its political eyes, and especially from the day labor became a financial issue in editorial offices, Howard has been a maker as well as a teller of the news. He instigated, for example, the blast against the Screenwriters Guild, which Rupert Hughes signed in May 1936. Hollywood Variety takes the credit for this exposure of hidden activities and secret diplomacy, which now characterize Howard methods. The Hughes pronunciamento is not only stale today, but its stupidity proven by passing time. What is important is the fact that Howard not only ordered it, but suggested its tenor. He had telegraphed a request for 500 to 1,000 words from Hughes, stating that, quote, "Only about 25 words printed here. Your statement, Screen Guild's closed shop policy would create Writers' Soviet. This attempt hogtie and standardize creative writing," unquote. He likens the screenwriters with the newspaper guild, saying, quote, "Net effect," unquote, of their success, quote, "would be guild dictatorship of American press on parity with communist, fascist, or Nazi unilateral press dictatorship abroad. Difference be here, guild would dictate policies, owners retain responsibility and foot bills. Would like you incidentally point out menace to democratic institutions of attempting limit editorial expression to proponents of any one school of political or economic thought," unquote. When Hughes obliged, Howard repaid him by a telegram of thanks, which concluded, quote, "Am asking the press associations to watch your efforts tonight, which I think are of vital importance to real liberty of the writing craft and honest to God freedom of expression," unquote. Hughes got the headlines, but the Screen Guild got a raw deal, and this seems to be part of the publisher's idea of, quote, "honest to God freedom," unquote. The episode cannot be dismissed as picayune. It illuminates, in fact, the entire new economic and political policy of Roy Howard, the triple policy of attacking labor, of manufacturing news, and of working the Deus Ex Machina racket. The 4-year war which Howard has waged against the newspaper guild is likewise no intramural affair, but part of the general policy. When the guild was started, it was the natural expectation of all concerned that the Scripps Howard outfit would be the first to recognize it. It is true that the minimum wages demanded would go harder with this organization than with most others, because, as I can testify from personal experience on the United Press, newspapermen were paid in 3 kinds of coin, 2 of which were neither negotiable nor good for taxes. These were first the privilege of working for a liberal service, and therefore escaping the old-fashioned charge of being, quote, servants of vested interests, unquote, or, as the phrase went up to the 1920s, quote, prostitutes of the press, unquote, and second, the quote-unquote byline. Thus, Westbrook Pegler, in 1917, wrote war correspondence at a minimum wage, but via his signed stories got a good-paying job with the Chicago Tribune, from which the United Press had to buy him back at an enormous salary. But we thought highly of Scripps Howard then, because it did not suppress the news or pervert the news, and we frequently refused better money from reactionary papers. The guild minimums were not excessive. The guild program seemed to be just the thing for the Scripps Howard outfit to make its own. But 1934 ended without any results, and February 1935 began 3 years of shadow boxing, stalling, and straddling, for which Roy Howard alone is blamed. Hearst is considered a straightforward, square-dealing, pleasant, liberal-minded, fair dealer compared to the evasive Howard. So far as New York is concerned, the situation was dramatically exposed in midsummer 1935 when the Post, announcing its complete recognition of the Guild, published an editorial openly suspecting the World Telegram of hypocrisy in its fight to change the Wagner labor bill and its attitude toward the newspapermen's organization. This editorial gave notice that the Post was willing to take the place of the World Telegram as the one liberal newspaper of the metropolis, and that the wheel horse of Scripps Howard liberalism was decidedly on the opposite road. A year later, Howard was still issuing statements and making charges which the New Republic showed were nothing but straw men and inventions. And it exposed the fact that Howard had circulated his fellow publishers with these unfair diatribes. Hearst had used them as a warning to his employees, given by a liberal, quote-unquote. Howard's idea was to bargain with his own men. In other words, he favored the company union, which labor and the liberal press then denounced, and which has since been held unlawful by the Supreme Court of the United States. Parenthesis. In the midst of all this headline-making by Howard, it may be noted that pay raises from about $2.50 to $5 a week were quietly made to United Press men without their asking for them. End parenthesis. In April 1937, the World Telegram signed a contract with the Guild covering wages, hours, and working conditions, but omitting the preferential shop, or, as the majority of publishers inaccurately called it, the closed shop. In October, when United Pressmen voted 277 to 84 for joining up with the Guild reporter said the vote meant that, quote, The publishers have failed to impress unipressors with their falsehoods about the Guild threat to freedom of the press," unquote. From now on, it was a pretty straight war of thousands of Scripps Howard employees against Mr. Howard, and quote-unquote falsehoods is one of the mild terms now frequently heard. Ostensibly, it was a conflict about the 5-day week, minimum wages, layoffs, pay cuts, and all the other troubles which affect the $100 million Howard empire, just as they affect the $2 billion Ford empire. And so we come to 1938, when the Guild, by bitter experience, has learned that its chief enemy is Roy Howard. And the Guild also sees the intriguing fingers of its enemy in many affairs, and notably in its first metropolitan test of strength, the Brooklyn Eagle strike, when Jonathan Eddy, executive vice president of the Guild, accused the big publishers of supporting the Eagle's Mr. Goodfellow for the purpose of breaking the unionization movement in New York. Eddy wrote in the Guild Reporter, January 3, 1938, quote, "Mr. Howard is probably the greatest of the adepts at stirring up weaker, I refrain from saying weak-minded, publishers to pull his chestnuts out of the fire. The picture today is one of the biggest publishers attempting to incite the smaller ones, whom they regard as suckers, into pulling the big fellow's chestnuts out of the fire as a matter of principle," unquote. From fighting the CIO Guild, there is but one step to fighting the CIO movement, and from there the steps become openly anti-labor, red-baiting, reactionary, and eventually fascist. Howard has now taken several of these steps. This is some interesting reading. This is written right about the time, right within a year or two, maybe the same year that The Grapes of Wrath came out by John Steinbeck. And, of course, that book is notorious for all the phony red baiting that went on in the San Joaquin Valley in California. But, wow, really totally contemporary of that. Anyway, folks, these have been chapters 5 and 6 from the long out-of-print book, the long memory hold book, Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. This has been Rejected Knowledge.